Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod. Here as we begin our second most popular Big Ten preseason preview, the number 7 Michigan Wolverines. Not that they're any favorite of virtually probably anyone who listens to this show, I'm guessing. But everyone wants to keep track of what's going on in the rival school. And, I've always thought it's a funny thing about this rivalry that Michigan State is always a rival, an actual rival for Michigan in virtually every sport. But Ohio State is only really a rival in football. Although, Michigan fans won't probably acknowledge that, but they know playing Michigan State, they always love beating Michigan State and whatever it is, because there are more Michigan State fans in their life than there are Ohio State fans around.
Well, I always find it, every once in a while, you will see somebody, usually at a network, try to make the Michigan-Ohio State basketball game or games, try to hold that out as something meaningful. It's, come on, man. We've watched, and when they're both good, does it mean something? Sure, the same way it means something when Michigan State and Illinois are both good or whatever. It has no extra juice. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
But you'll occasionally, rarely, but occasionally you'll see those attempts, and I always find it very, very funny.
Yeah. Well, and I even think about hockey. It's the same thing. I mean, even both programs are good. It's just a good game, but it's not like there's no extra animosity towards it. It is funny.
No, that's a one sport rivalry.
It is weird. Anyway, so a reminder that each year, Rod will predict the final standings of Big Ten, teams 1 through 18. And of course, today we're doing number 7, Michigan. That also means that you have the opportunity to beat Rod in the Beat Rod Challenge. $100 in Nudge Printing apparel. If you win, you basically just have to do better than Rod in your predictions 1 through 18. So send along your entries to me at Eric at tffionts.com. I've already gotten entries already. So 1 through 18, tiebreaker is the number of points Michigan State scores against Michigan this season. And as a reminder, they do play twice. Finally, we bring you all these season previews, pre- and post-game episodes, interviews, free to every Spartan fan, free of charge. So if you find this show has value in your life, consider heading over to tffionts.com/support and either send us a one-time gift or recurring gift through the links. We really appreciate it. All right, so let's talk about the Michigan Wolverines. Last year, I guess, I'm not sure exactly how best to describe it. Disaster, apocalyptic, the worst possible. It was just, completely a disaster season for them. Juwan Howard's swan song was one to be forgettable for the Michigan Wolverines, and I suppose in their case they're a little lucky that they won the national championship in football, so they could ignore a majority of that and then say that they didn't really care at all. They struggled basically from start to finish, just in different ways throughout the season. Initially, Howard couldn't coach because he had medical reasons. Although even not coaching as a head coach, he still got thrown out of a game. Then his top point guard, Dug McDaniel, got suspended only for away games for about 6 weeks, which was a weird suspension for academic reasons. And then they had some injuries. Anyway, they ended up going 8-24, 3-17 for a last place finish, by far in last place. The worst season, I think, since the 1960s for Michigan. And instead of getting fired, Juwan Howard ended up resigning. And although it was pretty clear that he was fighting right to the end until he decided to resign. So anyway, so Michigan can put that era behind them, an era that had a lot of promise and just never really kind of played up to what they thought it was going to be. And they got Destiny May, which is a one of the hottest coaches coming out. Pre-Calipari, sort of when that whole thing sort of melted down last year, but he came from Florida Atlantic, where they took them to the Final Four in 2023. He was thought to be a big coaching hire potentially that year, didn't leave and stayed at FAU. And then he was available, of course, last year. We did not think that he was going to end up at Michigan, although we knew Michigan job was going to be open, with some opportunities at maybe Ohio State or Indiana, which seemed to make more sense. Indiana, of course, didn't open up. They kept their coaching Woodson. And Ohio State decided to stick with their interim coach. So he ended up at Michigan, huge amount of transfers, brought some players from FAU, and as evidenced by where you have him in as number 7, you think there's some promise of this team, especially considering they were 14th last year. It's unlikely they'll be that bad this year.
Yeah, so we'll start with Juwan Howard. I would struggle to think of a more bizarre season than the one that he had when you take it all into totality. And really, you could say the last 3 years collectively with, fighting Wisconsin's coaching staff, unable to control Hunter Dickinson and missing the tournament. Yeah. And then on top of that, last year, the coup de grace, he can't start the season. So Phil Martelli's coaching, and you would think that might have been a positive for Michigan, but it really wasn't. They weren't ever together. And then he came back, and it was handled bizarrely because there was a stretch where Howard was on the bench, but he was claiming he wasn't the head coach. None of it made sense. Then you started to hear these rumors mid to late December that their best player, Dug McDaniel, had an eligibility problem. And that the rumors dragged on for a couple solid weeks at least without any kind of verifications what was going to happen. And then all of a sudden you had the strangest suspension I've ever seen in my life, where he was held out of away games. I guess the idea being, well, he's got academic issues he's got to address. So if he's not traveling with the team when they leave campus, then that will give him more time to hit the books. I've never heard of anything like that, ever. I would love someone to show me something similar, particularly that went on for it was like 6 weeks.
But it was just a random amount of time too, right?
Way.
It didn't align with the academic schedule or anything. It just
what connection did that have with anything to do with the academic calendar? It was, and top it all off, as we'll talk about more detail in a minute, McDaniel, although he was their best player, certainly their most important, he had a bad year. There's no two ways about it. And so but that said, him having a bad year, without him, they went from being a bad team to something well beneath that. Because they had no other point guard. So when you watch them play those road games without him, it had to be torturous for any of the 14 people that actually care about Michigan basketball deeply, because they really don't. When we were talking, I've said this a million times here in writing, various places. It's a fact. The school, they care about it more than, say, a garden variety SEC school does. But that's not saying much. And it gets back to what we were talking about at the outset here. Part of the reason the Michigan-Ohio State basketball rivalry doesn't mean much is because basketball isn't really a deeply held conviction matters kind of sport.
Either school in that sense.
At either of those schools.
Yeah.
Right. At either school. They care about it to a degree, but only to a degree. And so that's, and as you say, the football thing, although, I guess I'm not making any predictions because I can't pretend to know the answers, but we'll see if the annals of history declare they actually won a national championship in football last year. I don't know.
Forever an asterisk. Maybe,
I don't think you can. I would be hesitant to rule anything out. I would buy unlikely that they get stripped, but rule it out, I don't know. I've seen stranger things, but anyway, it was partially that, but I think more than that, it's this fan base's in relative indifference to the sport that made it very easy for people to just completely ignore and almost live in a sense of denial that the worst season they've had in the sport in my lifetime, and the vast majority of people who were paying attention's lifetime that they've ever had, was going on. And again, not just losing, but exacerbated at seemingly every turn by just the term clown show, clown world, that stuff gets overused. But that was Michigan basketball last year, let's be honest. And really for the last 3 years. They had that, he had his first season, they were okay. They were probably going to make the tournament, and then COVID hit. The COVID year that we talk about, that was the only season where it went well. In a strange, which fits the whole Howard tenure. In the strangest year we've ever seen, they won a lot of games. Congrats, guys. And then since that ended and we got back to some sense of normalcy, they skated into the tournament one year, they missed it the year after, and then last year, again, not just a bad year, but I say this in a general sense, the most stupid bad year I've ever seen. At every turn, the dumbest, most insane thing that could happen happened. And that's just, you can't ask for it to happen to a better bunch. It was amusing to be sure. And then honestly, I have to say though, I was a little bit surprised that he ended up leaving. And as
right.
you
We
said,
talked about
and
that
I
a lot,
agree, in the end, it seemed that he was perhaps a little more pushed than anything else. But I really thought that given the way that they view basketball, although you can say this, the old saw about Michigan used to be they'll tolerate pretty much anything from the basketball program as long as it's not embarrassing.
They had plenty of that.
To the university. This thing got embarrassing years ago, and it just kept getting worse. The only thing that was remaining was for Juwan Howard to actually knock somebody out at center court.
We thought that was going to
really
happen.
The only thing.
I think we both thought that, not maybe knocking someone out, but that it would be his anger that would be the reason that is a downfall.
Yes, we did, and that didn't end up being what ultimately ended the season. Although one incident I didn't mention, there was the whole altercation between
condition trainer,
his kid, and the year.
No, it was the same. It's hard to believe.
Son. Yeah, I know there was so much, and the strength and conditioning coach John Sanderson Sr., who ended up leaving. Well, he was reassigned, no longer with basketball's responsibility, and then he left. But there was, from what I understand, it depends on whose account you believe. What I understand, there was at least the threat of violence in that story. So it was just crazy, but I wasn't convinced they were going to do it, because Ward Manuel their AD just did not seem, to every hint you got, it did not seem that he was likely to make a move. And in the end, Howard, quote unquote, resigned. That brought it to an end. Now, then you look at what they've done. They go out and they hire Dusty May. And I don't think that Dusty May is a given huge success story there. People will point to the Final Four season 2 years ago at Florida Atlantic. Look, very impressive. There's no denying that. And he followed it up last year with, the vast majority of that team back. They did get back to the NCAA tournament, which, coming out of a league like the American, is not a given.
Yeah.
That's not a league that typically, is going to have 5 bids. So you give him his due for that. But I think in general, FAU was seen to be a little bit disappointing last season. I think that's fair to say. So we don't know. And before the Final Four season, he hadn't really, again, Florida Atlantic, tough place to win. You have to grade it on a curve. But he hadn't done anything. He's not one of these guys. Like, there are other guys. And when this job was open, We talked a little bit about that here, I believe. There were other guys. If I look at drawing a blank on his name, Josh, is it Schertz? The guy who was at Indiana State and is now at St. Louis. That guy, not only his success at ISU, but before that, at the Division II level, insane success. You know, there's a track record there. There are other
Darren
guys.
DeVries from Drake with his son, who's an All-American, right?
Right. And he ends up at West Virginia. There were guys that I just felt they don't have a Final Four, a D1 Final Four at least, on their resumes, but the track record was a little deeper, and it made me think, well, those guys are better bets. I was still very surprised Michigan got Dusty May. And the reason for that is, even everything I just said, there's also no denying that once he had indicated he was ready to make a move, he was going to be a hot name. And you looked around, I looked around, and particularly what it came down to apparently was him choosing between Michigan and Louisville. And I was shocked that a coach would pick Michigan over Louisville. And the reason I say that is Louisville is obviously a traditional power, unquestionably one of the 10 best programs in the history of the sport. But just as importantly, it's a program that has vociferous fan support. And particularly important to any coach, they've got donors with deep pockets who are willing to spend. And so I felt, and everything else you need, resources, all that stuff is all there. So I just felt, well, come on, this isn't really even a choice. I mean, Michigan's a nice job. You're going to get a certain amount of financial support. Yep. You're in the Big Ten. You know, there are great things about it, but it clearly comes out second tier compared to a job like Louisville. And yet Dusty May picked Michigan. Now, you mentioned Indiana. I do think if the Indiana job had opened, if they'd fired Mike Woodson, as some people thought they were going to, Dusty May went to Indiana. He was a student manager when Bob Knight was the coach there. I have to believe Dusty May would have taken the IU job. But that didn't happen. Ohio State, it was never clear to me how. I think Ohio State is maybe a marginally better job. It's a little better job than Michigan, mostly because they don't have a Big Ten competitor in their home state. I think that's one big difference. And I think despite the fact that the two schools probably care about the sport roughly in an equal fashion, I think Ohio State probably supports it, historically at least, a little better. But that they ended up going with John Diebler, the interim, so I don't know if Dusty May's candidacy ever really got off the ground there. But again, the Michigan-Louisville thing, really surprising to me. On the other hand, you look at where Louisville ended up going, they get Pat Kelsey, who, you know, was a hot mid-major coach in his own right, but not with May's kind of heat. And Louisville, and the fact that Louisville went that direction, didn't pull in a more established name, does suggest to me that for whatever reason, coaches weren't convinced, I guess, that this is maybe the same Louisville job that, say, Rick Pitino took. You know, I don't know. Yeah. And maybe some of it, the only thing I can think is that this might have been, well, one of two things. One, either May decided he really wanted to get back into Big Ten country, and that mattered. Or the other thing might be, this might be getting out ahead of the curve of continued realignment in the sports, because Louisville, of course, is an ACC program. They don't seem to be a likely addition to either the Big Ten or the SEC. I think their academics don't meet Big Ten standards for sure. And athletically, you know, the SEC, I don't know if they would look at Louisville football-wise as quite strong enough historically to fit the profile. That's a guess, but I feel fairly safe in making that. And maybe that factored in. Maybe he looks at it and says, you know what, this dance that's ongoing, it's going to be harder for Louisville to keep. I don't know that I believe that, because basketball, at least in terms of basketball, because basketball matters so much to those people that you might have an argument that Louisville they're certainly among the most insane fan bases in the sport. They're right there with anybody. And I mean that in good ways and bad. But maybe he looked at it and just said, I don't know if I think these guys are going to be a winner in what realignment does 2 years from now, 3 years from now, whenever that comes. I don't know that, and I haven't really even seen that as a reason speculated about so much. But it does occur to me when I look at it that maybe that's a reason why. But regardless, Michigan gets him in the end. And I think in terms of what was available to them, you can't argue with the idea that it was a pretty good outcome. Yeah. As I said, and as we alluded to, there were 2 or 3 guys that I felt personally were probably at least marginally better bets just because I liked the length of the track records a little bit better. But let's be honest, anybody coming from the mid-major level, which is what it was going to be, they were never going to get another high major coach to jump. But anybody coming from the mid-major level and bumping up, there's always a crapshoot element to it, because you are playing in a different sport at that point. Your recruiting is different. Your competition is different. All the expectations are different. All of those things matter. And there's no way to conclude for sure that Dusty May isn't going to be a better selection than, Nico Medved or Darren DeVries. He might be. On the other hand, I don't think it's a lock that he is. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to see. This year, I think, is going to be a bit of it's a bit of a mulligan, even though I think expectations are decently high, meaning I think people think they got a real chance to be a tournament team, and I would conclude with that, obviously, 7, or concur with that, rather, given where I picked them. But at the same time, it's not quite as scorched earth as, say, what Eric Musselman's going through at USC, but it's pretty close, damn close. So you are dealing, as we're going to see as we go through this, you are really dealing with a group of people who are new to the school, new to the coaching staff, and who are also new for the most part to each other. There are a few except, Michigan is a little bit more back than USC did. They're also in a situation where they've got guys who have actually played for May, one of them at least, but an important player who came with him, whereas Musselman doesn't have that advantage. He didn't bring any returning players from Arkansas. He brought a couple of recruits. Yeah. And so that's one of the reasons why I have Michigan a little higher than USC. But as we keep talking about, your guess is as good as mine as to where these teams slot in. But I do think there's enough for Michigan to be competitive. And then it's going to be interesting to see what actually happens in year 2 and going forward, because I think that's when we're going to start to see what Dusty May actually wants his program to be. That's why I say I think this year, regardless of what happens, you got to give him a little bit of a mulligan, because he's in a situation where it's truly an almost total rebuild, and it may not be the direction that he actually wants to take this thing long term. I could say this, the way he talks a lot closer to, say, Tom Izzo than he does Eric Musselman.
Yeah.
He's talked about wanting to build his program, mostly be a developmental program, signing, decently sized high school classes and continuing to bring those guys along over time. We'll see what actually pans out.
Yeah, Ben Johnson at Minnesota says the same thing, and he's just been unable to execute it, for whatever reason.
Right.
The one interesting thing, I'd never thought about the angle about the fact that the ACC is rumblings of it kind of breaking apart or losing pieces and stuff, and so that might be one hesitation.
And I just want to just emphasize again, that's total speculation on my part. I don't even think I've seen anybody suggest that, but it does occur.
Yeah, it's an interesting angle. But when I thought about as you mentioned, the Louisville versus Michigan, it reminds me a little bit of what we talked about Chris Collins, for instance, just in the sense that, you have to sort of decide what kind of program you want to take over. And there's an advantage to being at a Michigan or Ohio State, right? There's not that pressure. You still have the resources in the conference. And, you go to Louisville and you're not successful. They're not going to tolerate for that long. And, in this era, it might be hard to get rolling in just a few years until you're like a hugely established name. Like Calipari can go anywhere and he's going to be able to get guys to follow him and go and get recruits. I mean, he's going to get in every living room he wants to, no matter where he's coaching. Just like, Patino too. And I think, those guys have no trouble, but May, he goes up to Louisville. I mean, I don't think most people remember who the coach was at Louisville 4 years ago, right? I mean, it's just, they've been a bad program for a couple of years now. So I wonder if that's somewhat explains why he does it.
You make a good point, and that should definitely be a factor in there too. What's interesting about that, though, is you always, that's easy for us to say, and there's absolutely truth to it, that, Michigan, Ohio State, Texas would be another example. These places are kind of sweet spots because they have all that money that comes through to this program by virtue of what football does, but yet expectations are not crazy. Whereas at Louisville, they're crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't blame him. Kenny Payne did one of the worst jobs at an elite program I've ever seen. They fired him after 2 years, but that had to happen. Chris Mack was a slightly better than that, but wasn't winning and losing at Louisville levels. And then there was some scandal stuff, so he had to go as well. They just have not gotten it right with the last couple hires. But you do make a good point, and I think that might be a factor. What I was going to say is, most of these guys have egos.
Oh, sure.
And usually, I say, well, I understand there's more pressure, but I'm good enough that I'll be able to deal with it. That's how, you would expect that. Most of these guys probably have confidence that they can handle it. But perhaps Dusty May looked at that and said, why do I want to go into just an absolute cauldron where I can go to places that have similar resources, that I absolutely will have an opportunity to win everything I would want to win, but yet not be under quite that much heat, where I'm going to have a little more time to get my thing rolling before the posse comes after me, and that would be a rational line of thinking too. It's just, as I say, we're not talking about, a good job. Louisville is historically seen as an elite job, and for good reason. And it's rare to see a guy have an opportunity to go to a place like that and pass for a place like Michigan, where, let's be honest. Yes, there are certainly positive aspects to it, but there are also real issues. And I would say this, the main reason I was surprised, I maybe need to articulate this point a little more explicitly. The main reason I was surprised to see him take the job over a place like Louisville is, in this current environment where NIL is a factor, let's be honest, Michigan's had problems.
Yes.
They've lost guys due to NIL. They've also got an admissions issue
a couple in
that
the portal.
really has been a problem for guys, a lot of guys at certain points in their academic cycle. It has to do with the way Michigan tends to view credits and the attempt to carry them over from another institution, and what kind of class standing that transfer would have once they get to Michigan. And does that all line up in terms of eligibility? And they claim they've lost a couple of guys at least who, over the last couple of years, who apparently wanted to go there and didn't end up at Michigan for that reason. And so you put those two things together and you're like, geez, does a guy who's got choices really want to go there? Apparently Dusty May does. Now, we're going to go through it. He's got a large portal class, and on paper, at least, it looks like a reasonably good one. I think that when you look at the details of it, he seemed to go about it in a way that struck me as a little more thoughtful than what Juwan Howard did.
Yeah.
And maybe that will ultimately, meaning he was targeting guys that he figured and he knew he was going to be able to get in, whereas Juwan Howard was just targeting guys, and then they'd find out, oops, sorry, admissions isn't going to play ball. It might just simply be that. But we'll see over the long run, is Dusty May going to be able to retain the guys that he wants? Because they couldn't do it with Hunter Dickinson.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that, we'll see, but I'm not yet convinced that anything substantively has changed that will enable Dusty May to have more firepower in that way than his predecessor had. And if he doesn't, then it's going to continue to be an issue the moment anybody has real success at Michigan.
Yeah, well, no question. And time will tell. He could be a program much like Brad Underwood at Illinois, who has been very successful, churning and still kind of, managing to make it to the tournament at a very reliable rate and have competitive teams. So we'll see. Let's start talking about the team, though, and we'll go through the departing players as Michigan pretty much cleaned house, which reminds, of course, the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. If you need your house cleaned or your windows cleaned, there's no better people to contact and reach out to, or maybe just your business or high rise, whatever you have, they can do the job, big or small. They're very meticulous. They can do the inside, the outside of the windows. They can power wash your house. They will pretty much clean anything. And so your first call when you're thinking about that, thinking about cleaning something on your house, is the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. You can get 15% off if you mention Final Four when you go to your estimate. You can find ways to contact them. And again, they have a very large region in West Michigan. So I would reach out to them first, even if you're not exactly in Grand Rapids, because they've gone all the way out to Lansing for the state capital. You can reach them at our support page at the Final Fours on the schedule.com/support. All right. So the first and player we already alluded to and spoke about before is Dug McDaniel, 5'11" point guard. He just did not have a good year, sophomore year. Aside from the academic issues and the suspension, he averaged 16.3 points a game, 4.7 assists per game to 2.3 turnovers, shot 41, 33, and 77. But this kind of reminds you, you always would describe Xavier Johnson, Indiana, sort of the same way, sort of these kind of like hollow stats, like just he'd get his numbers, but it just didn't seem to help the team win. He wasn't like a winner. So anyway, he is transferred out along with his academic issues, and he's heading to Kansas State.
Empty stats. I think that's a fair way to describe it because, 41, 37, 77, decent shooting. The counting numbers are solid, but he was really bad defensively. And when you actually watched him play, this is not a guy who you were going to win with. It's just, you can't really articulate it better than that. It is possible in basketball to put up numbers that ultimately, they can look solid or even better than solid. But when you watch the games and how they come and the way that guy plays, you see, oh, no. This is not a guy who actually contributes to you winning basketball.
Well, I think, the best example is when that game against Michigan State in Ann Arbor, at the very end of halftime, he fouls the foul.
Fouls Davis Smith, right?
Who knocked down 2 free throws, but with 1 second, I don't know, there were 2 seconds left on the clock. He fouls him inexplicably, 90 or
half court. At half court.
In the basket.
Yeah, exactly. That's a prime example. But that's just a brain dead example. There were also, I think, issues with, for lack of a better word, selfishness.
Yeah.
That he played a self-oriented game, in my opinion, as opposed to a game where you're playing for others to make others better. And this is a subtle thing. And people sometimes, you've really got to watch to know what you're talking about, in my opinion. And not to harp on a Michigan State subject that we'll spend a little more time talking to when we get around to them. But, A.J. Hoggard, you would have guys defend him based on the fact, well, his assist numbers are good and he makes some spectacular plays for others. But, man, I am telling you, and I know it. I know it because of what I've been told by people who are impeccable when when you're talking about their connection to the program, the single biggest issue that Tom Izzo had with A.J. Hogard over his career at Michigan State was he far too often played a self-oriented game as opposed to a game where the emphasis was on making the team function better. And if you've got that problem at point guard, you've got a problem with a capital P. And that was the issue at Michigan when Dug McDaniel actually played. Capital P problem.
Yeah. Well, when you
not for the other side, for his team.
When you think of successful guards at Michigan State, point guards, I mean, that is absolutely, like, you look at Cassius Winston, yes, he was very productive offensively, but you never felt like he was that he was just getting his own. You know, it was always like, we need a basket, or I need to do some stuff, when you look back at the great point guards, that's how they all were. They weren't not like, and yeah, to your point.
Look at the guys who played with Cassius Winston. You know, look at their production playing with him, and how I don't think it's a reach or an unfair statement to say that for the most part those rosters, the last 2 years of his career, got about the most out of themselves that you could reasonably expect.
Yep.
You know, you could quibble here and there with a couple of things, but for the most part, I think that's a true statement. And a lot of that is down to the guy that was running things. And this has been true. You know, look, you can survive sometimes if you've got a really, really good team with a guy who plays a more self-oriented game. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. Kalen Lucas, who I think is a great Michigan State player. I personally think he did enough to have his jersey in the rafters. I don't know whether that'll happen. But I just say that to say I respect Kalen Lucas's game immensely. But Kalen Lucas was more of a self-oriented guy. That's just the nature of his game, you know? So you could, but look at the guys he played with. Travis Walton, Draymond Green. I mean, there were other guys who made that happen, that elevating others thing happen. Michigan didn't have anybody else. It was Dug or bust. And bust.
Yeah, a lot of
Bust.
All right, we'll go on to Terrence Williams, 6'6" forward. He transferred elsewhere in the Big Ten and headed out to USC. We've already talked about him. He averaged 12.4 points a game, 4.5 points a game, shot 43, 40, and 76. And he was one of the good parts of their team last year. Someone who's consistently played well, and I think it was a good teammate.
Yeah, I give him credit because he's a guy who I think expectations were early on that he was going to be a very solid kind of gap filler where whatever you needed, he would be able to give you. That he maybe wasn't great in any one area, but could do a lot of things reasonably well. That seemed to be how they viewed him. And then, the sophomore and junior seasons were not very good, but he stuck it out and ended up having a nice year under very, very difficult circumstances. It'll be interesting to see what happens for him at USC, as we discussed. There's a lot of new faces, his included, out there, and how it all sorts out and who's got big roles and who maybe has to take something of a backseat is yet to be determined. But I think he's got a chance. Based in my optimism on that is based on what he did last season, where he really did come through. He got his jumper finally honed to some level of consistency. He's not a great defensive player by any stretch, but at least you don't worry about his effort. And he can help you a little bit on the glass too.
Yeah.
So,
and the player that doesn't surprise me who left, but there are certainly a lot of people on the Spartan Mag board who were talking about possibly transferring back to Michigan State. Terrace Reed, 6'10" sophomore center, averaged 9 points a game, 7.2 rebounds a game, 1.4 blocks a game. He was a player who looked like he had a lot of promise as a freshman. Last year, I felt like he didn't get a whole lot better. Shot 52% from the floor, but 58% from the line. He didn't really improve there offensively too much. And, I don't know if it's a system that he just needs a new place or new coach. Either way, he's transferred to UConn, which is obviously a place for a lot of success for big men. So maybe that's the change he needs, and maybe he'll be able to expand his game some.
The improvement didn't really happen, and he might be a guy that you can give a little bit of a pass to based on what we were talking about with McDaniel. Yeah. It's hard. It's hard for a center who's really going to be reliant upon other people getting him the ball in good spots to do offensive damage. I think the bigger surprise to me, but boy, it just happened across the board with that team, was the defensive regression. The single thing that impressed me more than any other element of his game as a freshman was the way a guy with that big a body, because he's a big kid. He's not just 6'10". He's probably about 250, 260. Big kid. How well he moved his feet. If you remember the loss that Michigan State took 2 years ago at Chrysler, in large part came down to the end of that game. Michigan played him at the 4 alongside Dickinson, and Reed just tattooed Michigan State on the offensive glass down the stretch of that game because he was just too big to handle. But they could get away with it because he could actually move his feet well enough to guard 4s. I really thought coming into last season, Michigan was the complete opposite of what I thought they would be, at least until the roof caved in. They were actually a decent offensive team, and I thought that was the big question mark. But I expected them to be really good defensively, and they were horrible. Everybody who came in with a reputation as a good individual defender or who had played for programs that were very good defensively the year prior just stunk. And Terrace Reed was a guy coming back who had done those things, and he wasn't good there too. There was a point, as you mentioned, that it was discussed as to whether Michigan State might pursue him in the portal, and it would have made sense because Michigan State recruited him very hard out of high school. It was Michigan, Ohio State, Michigan State. There were the heavy hitters in that recruitment. And so it wouldn't have been a shocker to see them get involved. And then you also have the fact that Sadie Washington comes over from Michigan to Michigan State on the staff. He was the big man coach at Michigan, so he apparently had a good relationship. I think he was also the point man in his recruitment out of high school. So there were a lot of reasons why that added up. In the end, it didn't seem like Michigan State got heavily involved in it. As you say, he ended up at UConn. Michigan State may well see him. It's possible that, second semifinal game at Maui, there's a reasonable chance that they do see him. And it'll be interesting to see what UConn does with him. You're right. Dan Hurley's done a really nice job with his big men. I don't even know if it's a given that Terrace Reed will start there. I haven't looked in depth at UConn's roster, but my recollection is that there's at least a possibility that he'll be in the rotation, but not necessarily a starter. But it'll be interesting to see what strides he makes. I think for him, it's a get back to doing what he did as a freshman defensively, and then let everything flow from that. I still think he's got potential to be a really good player.
Sure.
I absolutely think that's there.
All right, so let's talk about one of those really bad defenders, Olivier Kamua, 6'10" power forward transfer from Tennessee, much ballyhooed. Michigan fans super excited about him. He averaged 14.8 points a game and 7.1 rebounds a game, shooting 51, 33, and 67. Came from a very, was by all accounts was a very good defender at Tennessee, and he was not that at Michigan.
It was just really hard to understand. I think he's one of those guys that when it started going south, and I'm saying this from the outside, I have no way of knowing whether this is true. It's just a perception. But it felt to me like he was one of those guys that maybe checked out a little bit, not entirely, but in terms of continuing to care about attention to detail, which, let's be honest, a lot of defense is that. Team defense for sure, where it's understanding your responsibilities, it's playing on a string with the next guy and the guy after him, and it all just seemed to fall apart. His 3-point shooting didn't step up. Yeah. He had actually had a pretty good year shooting the ball at Tennessee, and that didn't really carry over. He also got hurt late in the year. So it wasn't a terrible year. He was probably their best player. I mean, I think McDaniel was that coming into the season. I think if you look at who made the greatest impact on the court, it was probably Kamua. but it just wasn't what I think they thought it would be. It wasn't what I thought it would be.
Yeah, we can pretty much say that about every player on this team. Next would be Trey Jackson.
Pretty much.
Trey Jackson, 6'10", Seton Hall transfer. Despite his name, didn't score and shoot very well. He averaged 5 points a game and 2.4 rebounds a game.
Yeah, it was Michigan had such a weird roster last year. They just had a ton of guys that really profiled as power forwards.
Yeah.
And he was one of them. And, the hope was, well, maybe he could play some 5 and his shooting will give Michigan's offense some advantages, that he could stretch the floor. That didn't pan out. Yeah, it just didn't really work out.
And then snake bit, Jaden Llewellyn, 6'4" guard, missed the previous season due to injury. Banged up last year too, I guess he played a little over half the games, but he was still never quite right most of the game, it didn't feel like. Averaged 5.2 points a game, shot 38, 40, and 70, and sort of as the backup point guard when McDaniel's out, when he wasn't injured.
Yeah, and I think, I look at that number, I said 40% from 3. Yeah, they could have used that a little more. Maybe if they'd actually had an intelligently put together roster and he didn't have to play any point guard, because this was for 2 years running. Remember, that's the reason they lost the Collins kid who transferred out to Arizona State. Because they signed Llewellyn. And I remember talking to a guy I know whose kid played in the Ivy League, so he watches a lot of Ivy League basketball. And Llewellyn, of course, had played at Princeton prior to transferring to Michigan. And I said to him, because I'd seen him play a couple times, and I'd looked at the stats. I said, is he a point guard? And he said, absolutely not. Well, Michigan so they lost a guy. And then, as it turned out, when they needed him to help out in the wake of Dug McDaniel's adventure, he wasn't really, again, he could shoot the ball, but running an offense and actually being a point guard in any meaningful sense of the term, that just was never on the cards. I just, as I often said, and this would be one area that Dusty May can have improvement without even having to try very hard, is frequently Michigan would make decisions where you look at it and you say, this doesn't make any sense. What are they thinking? And that can be improved pretty easily. But Llewellyn as a point guard was one of those decisions. Never made any sense.
Yeah, the roster construction was always puzzling with Michigan, and you felt very much like it was, you see these NFL drafts sometimes where you're just taking the best player on the board because, you have enough room, and you're like, well, if he doesn't work out at quarterback, he can be my tight end or something, where you saw like with Antoine Randall, for instance, at wide receiver. You just can't do that in basketball. There aren't enough positions and players. You can't just have...
So is some of that, and then also, admittedly, some of it was, again, down to Howard's, the way he approached the portal in going after guys who they were just never going to get in.
Like Travis Love, right? Right? Yeah.
Yeah, the Love kid at Arizona. Yeah, right. For sure, a prime example of that. And would he have been a point guard last year for Michigan if they'd signed him? Well, they certainly would have been able to play some there. I think they probably would have ended up playing him more off the ball because Dug would have had the point guard position. But yeah, but that's all part of it too. If you're pursuing guys, it's one thing to pursue guys and you lose them to somebody else. Okay, that happens, But when you're pursuing guys that you should have had reason to know you're never going to get in, even if they want to commit to you, that's a whole other deal.
It was Caleb Love, right? Yeah.
Caleb Love, correct.
So next is Youssef Kayat, a 6'9" player from Lebanon. Didn't really play much, and he's going to be facing Michigan State soon this season when he comes to town for Bowling Green.
Playing for Fowler native Todd Simon and former Spartan great Tum Tum Nairn. Yeah, he was kind of a weird late signing, and the 14 people that care about Michigan basketball got exercised when they got him because, he played for Lebanon's national team, and he's 6'9" and skilled, and I think they started to convince themselves that maybe this was another Franz Wagner. Well, it has not played out that way thus far. We'll see if he's at a level more appropriate to his game moving down to Bowling Green.
Well, Lebanon's not exactly known for the basketball players, so maybe that would have been a tip too.
Well, in fairness, the argument was, well, he was 18 and playing for the national team, which, maybe suggests that you actually are a guy with potential, but you're right.
If he's playing for the Lithuanian team at 18, I'm like, or the Serbian team, like, okay, yeah.
It's right. So more of a certainty, yes.
And finally, the last departure, George Washington III, 6'3" freshman guard out of Ohio. He was a guy who definitely was, you would thought naturally would be the replacement for Dug McDaniel when he went out, whatever you want to call it. But he was clearly out, just overmatched in the Big Ten. He's going to be heading to be a Spider with Richmond next year.
Yeah, he originally committed to Ohio State, and then there was a decommitment there that, as I understand it, was more on the Ohio State end of things that they had decided. And then he ended up at Michigan, and it just didn't, it didn't play out. I mean, sometimes there are times you can look at a guy and say, well, okay, he's raw, but we need to give it some time, let him develop and see what we've got. Maybe a year or two down the line. And of course, the obvious examples there are with big men. You want to be careful not to pull the plug too quickly, because sometimes it can take those guys a minute to figure it out. But I will say, usually with guards, you have a clearer picture. You would at least see, well, okay, there's some light at the end of the tunnel here. I could see this one element or two elements of his game that should help him actually contribute as time goes on. And then there are other times you can look at a guy as a freshman and you can just tell, well, he probably doesn't have it. And I think that was the case with George Washington III. So as you say, he will be playing for Richmond in the A-10.
Well, the next fairly short segment is going to be on returning players from Michigan, brought to you by Nudge Printing. If you're returning back to East Lansing for tailgating or back to the Breslin Arena for the games, make sure you've got the right attire. You can head on over to the Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. Gabe and Brittany, great Spartans. They have all kinds of apparel there. I mean, all kinds of logos and vintage things. And I don't know, it's amazing. Got some stuff for my daughter, just came in the mail the other day. So now she looks like a Spartan walking around campus. She has a really cool jacket, super comfortable. And she got like this hooded zip up sweatshirt, super soft and comfortable. She's very, very excited to be wearing that. So anyway, you can't go wrong with Nudge Printing. They got the sweet hats too. You should check those out as well. You can go to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. 20% off for listeners of this show if you type in Final Four at the checkout. So, I mean, you can't beat a great apparel and 20% off. Can't lose. You can begin with Namari Burnett, 6'5" wing. He averaged a little under 10 points a game, 4.1 rebounds a game, shot 40, 35, and 72. He came from Alabama, I believe it was the year before. Another person who was supposed to be a really great defender, and he was anything but last year as well. But, maybe it's a team concept more or less. Who knows?
Yeah, it's hard to know. And when you see it happen to multiple guys, as I say, I think once the season clearly was not going to go the way everyone had hoped, it was tough to keep everybody and their attention to detail. And truthfully, who was enforcing it? The guy at the top was in, he's out, he's in, he's out. It's not difficult for me to give guys at least something of a pass on last season, given what it was. Burnett's, an interesting case because he was a McDonald's All-American. I mean, this was a highly regarded player. He started, if I remember correctly, he started out at Texas Tech. Then he transferred to Alabama, and he was a significant part of that Alabama team 2 years ago that was ranked number one and, had a lot of people believing would win the national championship. Didn't work out that way, but he was a significant part of the rotation. And then he opted to transfer to Michigan. And I'm sure that his thinking was that he would play a little bit more significant of a role. As it turned out, the minutes were probably up at Michigan, but the production was pretty much, wash. I mean, it was similar. Not quite a double-digit scorer. Shooting numbers were okay. I was surprised by his defense because he definitely had a reputation as a very strong individual defender. And I'm not saying he was a disaster at Michigan, but he was not the defender that I thought he would be. So I'll say this. It was interesting to me because you automatically assume in these kind of coaching situations in the modern era that everybody just clears out. And for him to come back
surprising.
Was interesting because really my understanding is Juwan Howard had a lot to do with his coming to Michigan. They're both natives of Chicagoland. And Howard had really tried to get him the first go around out of high school. So it was a little bit surprising to me that Michigan was able to keep him. Good move, because I think that while I don't believe Burnett is ever going to live up to advanced billing coming out of high school, I think he very clearly is capable of being a contributing player to a winning team. So I think it's an advantage for Dusty May, certainly, that he was able to keep him around. And he would be one of the few guys that left that I would have thought, yeah, you probably want to keep him. If you can, he could help you next year.
Next is Will Cheddar, 6'8" forward, averaging 6.8 points a game, 2.4 rebounds a game, shot 58, 52, and 72, but obviously if he's only averaging less than 7 points a game and it's 52% three-point shooter, he's not out there a lot, or he hurts you in other ways, and defensively he was not very good. And I don't know, I think he was a very underwhelming player for the most, except his outside shooting, which has improved from his freshman year, I'll say.
Much improved. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how they use him, because I think this. Athletically, he's a 4 or even a small ball 5. He's just not a good enough athlete to ever play any other position. All right. And I can see a path for him being a guy who can be productive very situationally. It's going to be interesting to me to see how Michigan opts to deploy him, because I look at this team and there's a guy that I think he can be part of the rotation. My question's going to be how many minutes that adds up to, because I don't think he's ever going to solve the defensive shortcomings. I just don't think he can be a good defender. And he's not ever proven to be a capable rebounder either.
Right.
There's basically one thing he's proven that he can do at the high major level, and that's shoot the 3. That's it. Now that's helpful, and you can find opportunities for that, but can you do it in a way, it's one of these things where it to me, his minutes fall very much into the concept of diminishing returns. The longer you play him, the more likely it is that his weaknesses are going to get exploited. But you might be able to do things like stealing a few possessions with him, playing him in a 2 or 3 minute burst and get him in, get a couple threes up, get him out before the opposition is really locked in on isolating him and making him pay for having him on the floor. That'll be an interesting thing to see how Dusty May opts to use him and how big a role he has. But, 52% shooting from 3 does give you a tool to work with.
And finally, Jace Howard, son of Juwan Howard, 6'6" senior. He decided to stay, only averaged 2.6 points a game, 1.8 rebounds a game. My expectation is that you would hardly ever see him on the floor.
Yeah, but again, kind of maybe a little bit surprising to me that he opted to hang around, which I guess is an indication that,
class,
the family,
school,
obviously,
who knows?
Yeah. And obviously the family wasn't that furious about the way things ended. But yeah, I think short of a rash of injuries, he's probably not going to play very much.
So we'll then go over newcomers to the team. And of course, there are plenty since we had a lot departing. This is brought to you by the Brothers Just Two Gutters. As you are looking at your foundation, your house, make sure you do not have a bunch of water getting in your basement, pooling around your house, causing all sorts of problems. Maybe you have a bunch of leaves in your gutters. You need them cleaned out. The Brothers Just Two Gutters can do really whatever needs to be done to your gutters. Do you need them repaired? Do you need them replaced? Do you just need them cleaned out? You want some leaf guards on? Do you want to put some heaters on so you don't have the ice buildup and snow buildup during the winter? They can do all those things and more, whether it's a commercial or residential. They do great work. They fixed my house up, and now I no longer have to stain my front door every year. So they can do it really whatever you need done. Great pricing, very friendly people, very good professionals, and they just do gutters. They don't do anything else, so they're experts at it. You can find more information at our support page at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support, and you get 10% off if you mention Final Four when you get your estimate. And whether you're on the east side or the west side of the state of Michigan, they can take care of you. So check out the brothers at Just Do Gutters, and they'll give us a segment where at the end here, Rod's going to have to tell us which player other teams are going to have to keep in the gutter for Michigan. We'll begin with newcomers, Vlad Golden. You mentioned earlier that one player from Dusty May followed him from Florida Atlantic. That's Golden. 7-footer, averaged 15.7 points a game, almost 7 rebounds a game, 1.7 blocks a game, shot 67% from the floor, 66% from the line. And he's certainly a good anchor to have right in the middle and a good offensive piece to start, and a good defensive piece, I suppose, too, from around the rim.
Huge addition. And it's funny, when May got the job, I think there was an expectation that he was going to bring more guys with him from FAU than he ended up doing. Golden is the only actual FAU player. May also brought one recruit who we'll mention, but he only got one. But if he was only going to get one, Golden's not a bad one to get. Right. On the Final Four team, he was a significant part of the rotation, but he was offensively, at least, he was a little more limited in terms of how much they counted on him to do. Last year, it seemed that his role expanded, say almost 16 points a game, 7 boards, a little shy of 2 blocks a game, and 67% from the floor. He's taking great shots. He's not a stretch threat, but he knows how to play around the rim. He's also a guy, Dusty May wants to play fast. So we're likely going to see Michigan playing at a faster tempo than we're used to seeing, because they haven't really done that in forever. I'm thinking about this. I mean, God, even back in like Frieder's era and Fisher, they didn't really, people think about those teams and the athletes they had, but they were never really a full tilt running team. And they certainly weren't that under John Beeline. His teams tended to play very slowly. Yeah. And Juwan Howard's teams played very slowly. So bring it back to Golden. The nice thing about him is that he's a big who can be a factor in a half-court game as a post option, but he can also run the floor. He's also used to playing that way. So, really, really good offensive rebounder, get you some second chance points. It'll be interesting to see how they play him defensively. At Florida Atlantic, my understanding is they played a fair amount of drop coverage with their 5, and he'll certainly help them at the rim. It remains to be seen if he is playing consistently drop, what that's going to present in terms of opportunities for the opposition in the mid-range in pick and roll offense. But I think obviously a very, very important addition for them. One other thing worth mentioning, that productivity only came in about 25-ish minutes a night. And I have seen suggestions, I mean, the proof will be in what actually happens, but I've seen suggestions that they don't really anticipate his playing a lot more than that. So this is not likely, so it seems, to be a Zach Edey situation where all of a sudden he is playing 33 minutes a night. It seems more likely that he's going to play, mid 20s. Right. Maybe edge into the high 20s, but that's probably about it.
And so who better to replace you than another 7-footer, Danny Wolf, 255-pound big. He still has 2 years of eligibility left, coming from Yale. He averaged 14.1 points a game, 9.7 rebounds a game, 1.3 blocks a game, shot 47, 35, and 72. So obviously he's got some ability to stretch the floor a little bit. But, another big guy, and I'm not sure exactly how well he moves.
Yeah, he's really interesting because he's a highly skilled big kid. Now, he was very effective in the low post at Yale. I think, it's a different deal
Right.
at the Big Ten level. So I think it still remains to be seen whether, I don't think he'll be bad by any means, but will he be a real load to deal with in the post in the Big Ten, or will he merely be, solid? That remains to be seen. But he's very skilled. The 3-point shooting gives you one facet of that. But when you watch him on video, what you find is that he's got a remarkably good handle for a guy his size. He didn't have huge assist numbers, but he's a very capable passer. Like, to the point that I think you would feel very comfortable with him, running some high-low stuff where he's high, and you're looking at him as a guy to play through a little bit. So there are elements there that you really like offensively. I think that the big question is defense, because they are talking about playing him together with Golden. And I think assuming that happens, when you think about the minutes, and if Golden's, it's why I brought up Golden maybe only playing, mid to high 20s, that probably means, since Wolf's the only other true center, really the only other center, period, on the roster, you would think he soaks up the rest of those minutes, which means that it's not like he and Golden are necessarily out there together for 25 a night, but maybe more like 15. I think it's an open question.
Yeah.
Very, very open. Wolf is skilled, but he's not athletic. And yes, there are teams that will play a bigger player at the 4 in the Big Ten. That will happen. But there are also teams that won't. And there are teams who will play bigger guys, like Michigan State, for example. If Xavier Booker is being guarded by Danny Wolf, I'm okay isolating Xavier Booker and saying, take his ass to the basket, whip his ass. And I think he can. That's going to be an issue. So that plan for the Twin Towers thing, offensively, I've got no issue with it. Defensively, I think the jury is very much out as to how much they can play that tandem together and get away with it. Maybe they will. Maybe Wolf will be better enough, or the opposition, just for whatever reason, won't be able to exploit it enough, and Michigan will win that choice. They'll come out on the positive end of it. But I think it's very much something that we're going to need to see, and there is reason to doubt it. And if it's a problem defensively, well, that may force some changes in terms of how Dusty May would prefer to operate.
One thing Juwan Howard never really seemed to have a good handle on is to have a good point guard. It looks like Dusty May's figured out that he's going to get actual point guards to come and play point. He's got Trey Donaldson, 6'2", transfer from Auburn, where he averaged 6.7 points a game, 3.2 assists per game, and 1.3 turnovers a game, so almost a 3-to-1 assist-turnover ratio. He shot 47, 41, and 78.
Good addition. I mean, on the surface at least, Donaldson looks like the kind of guy you want at that position. He does everything offensively well, makes good decisions, obviously shot the ball very, very well. And I think it's pretty obvious that he's going to be the starter at Michigan, and probably a guy who, and again, I mentioned that Dusty May wants to play fast. One effect of that is, some of the Michigan people who actually pay attention to the sport, there aren't that many of them, but the ones that do, they're going to have to get used to something, I think, with Dusty May that they struggled with over a long period of time. And it has to do with pace of play. You would occasionally see critiques from even people who purport to understand the game and follow Michigan, critiques of Tom Izzo's playing time allocations, how many minutes he would have guys play. And you would try to explain to them, well, that's a function of the way Michigan State plays. He wants guys to be going full tilt and to be fresh. And when you try to play fast the way that they do at MSU, that probably means you're not going to play guys as many minutes. And there would be a lot of ignorance on that point. Well, it's coming to your town. kids. And I think that's going to be the way it is with a lot of these guys, and that would include Trey Donaldson. If they play the way that Dusty May says he wants to play, I don't think Trey Donaldson's going to play 33 minutes a game. I think it'll be too much. So, but definitely a solid. Yeah, he hasn't done it as the guy. He hasn't yet played, heavy minutes, whatever those heavy minutes means. But I think there's good reason to suspect that he will at least give Michigan very solid point guard play, and there's the potential for even better than that.
And then kind of going back to our conversation at the beginning of the show, player who probably wasn't even realizing that he was transferring to his rival, Roddy Gale, 6'4" wing from Ohio State, averaged 13.5 points a game, 4.6 rebounds a game, 3.1 assists per game, shot 45 and then 28, 83.
A good addition in that you're getting a guy who's a proven double-digit scorer at another Big Ten program. So you know that much. There are things to be enthused about, for sure. There are things to wonder about as to how much better it can get. So the three-point shooting was a problem last year for him, way down from his freshman year. His freshman year, he was 40% plus. Last year, played a little bit more. Volume was higher. Accuracy way lower, 28%. That needs to improve again, but you know that at least the potential is there for that to happen. He's also, which is a nice element to have, if he can dial in a little more efficiency with the jumper, he's also proven to be fairly effective getting to the basket. He averaged 4 free throw attempts per game. So that's a reasonably good number for a wing. It shows you that there's a decent level of activity and willingness to get into traffic, take some physical defense, take some shots, draw some fouls. And he's capable of finishing plays when he gets there. And then I would say defensively, I don't think I've seen signs that he's great, but he's at least functional. So this is a guy who pretty obviously looks to be a starter on the wing to me at this stage. I think the question is, he's got 2 years left. The question is he a solid player for you, or is he able to be maybe a little bit better than that? Because the potential is there for the latter. And I would be saying this about him if he were back in Columbus.
Yeah, right.
Same story.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he has shown you enough to suggest there is the potential, maybe even for an all-conference level player at one level or another, maybe not first team, but second team or third team. Their potential is clearly there for that. But can he find the consistency in a new program, new coach to make that happen? Or is he still maybe struggling to put all the pieces together to be more than just, oh yeah, he's a solid starter?
All right, so moving on to the next player, Sam Walters, 6'10" transfer from Alabama. So I guess the Alabama corridor is still open. He averaged 5.4 points a game, 2.4 rebounds a game in about 13 minutes for the Tide. He shot 43, 39, and 83. A lot of his shots coming from outside the arc, but that is sort of Alabama basketball.
You're right about that, but it was also his reputation coming out of high school. Walters was, if I remember correctly, he was a guy that was sort of a late riser in recruiting circles when he was coming out of high school. And he started to get attention really during like the spring of his final year of AAU, and then ended up at Alabama. Did some decent things. I mean, playing 13 minutes a game as a freshman for that team, a deep team, that's, and he produced. The shooting numbers were where you'd expect to see him, 39% from three, when 2/3 of your shots are coming from out there. That's okay. That's kind of as advertised. I think the problem is he hasn't shown that he's really likely at this point to be a plus player in other ways. So there's no interior offensive game to speak of. He hasn't shown really much in the way of post ability, let's say, which is okay. That's not, you could be a productive player and not have that in the modern game as a big part of your repertoire. I'm just saying doesn't seem to be there for him. I also think there are issues defensively. He hasn't shown a real willingness or capability to play physically. And in the Big Ten, that can be a problem if you're playing the 4 or the 5. Now, I don't think they'll play them any 5 unless they're desperate.
Yeah.
But then it's what we were talking about, the minute allocations. If Wolf is truly your backup 5, then that's going to limit how many minutes he plays at the 4, which means there are going to be minutes at the 4, and that's where Walters, I think, will primarily compete with Shetler to Shetter to see who gets the lion's share of those, because I don't really see either of those guys as any kind of ideal option at the 5 as a backup. But again, as I said with Shetter, there's a guy in Walters who definitely can help you. When you have a skill like he has, there's a role for that somewhere. It's just a question of how big it is.
And the final transfer to the team, Reuben Jones, 6'5" combo guard from North Texas. He averaged 12.1 points a game, 3.6 rebounds a game, with 3.7 assists a game, and a little over 2 turnovers a game. He shot 40, 42, and 77.
They think he's a big addition. And it's funny to say that about a guy who might not even necessarily start, because I think it's pretty clear Donaldson's going to be the starting point guard. I would kind of expect at this point that Burnett and Gale will be the starters on the wings. So that would mean Jones is coming off the bench. But I think even if he is coming off the bench, he's going to play a lot. And again, I go back to what I said about Michigan fans are going to have to adjust to the idea that they're watching a program where guys don't play 33 minutes a night if they're one of your better players. Yeah. That's just not what Dusty May wants to do, ideally. And so there's a big role, even if he's not starting, available for Reuben Jones, because he's capable of helping you in a lot of ways. He's 6'5". He can obviously score. He shot well. A little bit of rebounding punch, and he's a playmaker. Now, I don't think he projects to beat Donaldson out at the point, but I think he could be a pretty nice backup to have at that position if he's playing, maybe 12 minutes a night at the point. They really like him as a defender. Dusty May didn't coach him, but he played against him last year when Jones was at North Texas. So I think there was a personal viewing that led to Michigan really pursuing him. And the feeling seems to be that he's going to be a guy, you could see him playing, 24 minutes a game at all three perimeter positions. Right. Yeah. And not starting, but playing starter minutes. I think that's entirely, I would even say probable that it works out that way. I think the track record at North Texas is very, very good. The question here, as it always is for guys like this, is how does it translate? Exactly. And we'll have to see. But they're enthusiastic about him. And if they're right, he will be a very significant player because of the different things he can do.
And then we'll begin talking about some of their recruits. Begin with Jarrell Brooks, 6'3" point guard out of Grand Rapids. And he was recruited by Howard and his crew, but decided to stick around and stay with Michigan.
Yeah, Fat Brooks. Out of Grand Rapids Catholic Central, he won a state title there. He was a guy that had a lot of people high on him early in his high school tenure. Michigan State was involved in his recruitment. They offered him. But by the end, honestly, it would not have surprised me to see this fall apart. And if it had, I'm not sure that Brooks would have been at a high major. Mm-hmm. It just feels as if the perception of him is that his game did not develop the way people thought that it might. And I think that's fair from what I've seen. He's a good passer, but he's never really developed as a jump shooter. And then his athleticism does not really pop at the Big Ten level either. He's not a particularly explosive athlete. Imagine, because he got some Cassius Winston comparisons, But imagine what would Cash have been if he couldn't really shoot. I mean that, and I don't even say that facetiously.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah.
I mean, because shooting was a knock on Cash coming out of high school. People questioned what kind of shooter he was. And I think Cash was also a better passer than Brooks, but at least it gets you into the ballpark of understanding what the issues are. To me, it's going to be interesting to see if he sticks in Ann Arbor, because as you said, he committed to the previous regime. Dusty May opted to keep the offer as valid, keep the commit as valid, and Brooks opted to still want to come there. I do think there's a possibility that there may be a few minutes a game for another point guard, especially if they want to use Reuben Jones a lot on the wing as well, off the bench. And I think there will be, not a huge role, but maybe something. It'll be interesting to see if Brooks can win that, and then what happens if he doesn't.
All right, then Justin Pippen, 6'3" combo guard, borderline top 100 guy. With the last name, is he related to Scottie Pippen?
He is. Yep.
Yeah, I wondered.
Borderline top 100 guys, you said. Combo guard, but I think his future seem more off the ball than on it. It's interesting. I mean, I think he's a developmental guy, and I mentioned that near the outset that May at least professes to want to run a developmental program, which doesn't mean you never take transfers, but it means you're probably not taking as many annually as he had to this year. He wants to have a core of his guys.
Right.
And so Pippen would be seen as a guy that they hope to develop. There's also some thinking that he's got maybe some physical development yet to come, which would be nice. But they like his potential as a playmaker and as a defender, and they also think he can shoot a little bit. So again, with the way they want to play, I do think there's a role for somebody, and he would be the most obvious candidate to maybe slip in and get 8 minutes a game as a wing, something like that. I think if Reuben Jones is the backup, he's going to eat a lot of that, but probably not all of it. And so there's a chance for Pippen. I actually think he's probably the most likely of the three freshmen to play, a decently sized role. And by that, I mean, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that. Right. Yeah. Because they need the help.
Right. And finally, Lorenzo Cason, another point guard project. He's one from outside the top 150, 6'3" guard, can shoot. But I imagine, again, when talking about development, this is probably another developmental player.
Yeah. But I would say this. I think there's probably or possibly just a few minutes a game available for one point guard, and there's two candidates. It's Fat Brooks and Cason. If I'm betting, and I've seen Brooks play a decent amount, I've not seen Cason. But if I'm betting, I'm probably going to bet on the guy that was recruited by this by this head coach, at least, to Florida Atlantic, and who opted to follow him to Michigan, and the coach wanted him to follow because he let him do it. I'm probably putting my money on that guy. The word is he needs physical development, needs to get better defensively, but I like where he's at offensively. So I think it's probably one or the other of those guys, and I don't even mean just for this year. I think probably in terms of role in the program, it would not be surprising to me to see one of the two transfer out after this year. That just seems kind of inevitable.
All right, so after going through the lineup for Michigan next season, who is a player you think most teams will try and keep in the gutter for Michigan this next year?
Well, I think the easy choice is Vlad Golden, so I'll go with him. Yeah. He's there. He's Dusty May's guy. He was very productive last season, and you have to think that they're gonna look to get him the ball a lot, and he's proven to be able to be productive in that role as the primary big man option at Florida Atlantic. I think he'll do that again at Michigan, and yeah, he would be the obvious choice. I would say that maybe the dark horse for me would be Roddy Gale if he figures it out. But I'm going to go with Golden.
All right, so overall for the Michigan team, you have them ranked 7th in the Big Ten, so that's, I suppose like 7, 8 seed in the NCAA tournament probably. Just something like that probably. So a team that's in, not on the bubble, but not beating the world. Dusty May, I think that'd be a very good result for your first year coming to a new program where you have to basically start over again. And especially if you're playing a different way, it'll certainly be interesting to see what Michigan looks like this year. It always is, everyone in Michigan State's interested in what's going on at Michigan. But I think going through these parts, barring, massive injury bug or something like that, it's hard to imagine they'd be as bad as they were last year.
Oh, I think that's off the table. I think if for no other reason than
that was historically bad.
Whatever I think of Dusty May in terms of, was he the best possible choice? And, is he likely to be a guy, as we talk about all the time, pretty much any mid-major guy who gets hired at a Big Ten school had a lot of success at the mid-major level. Now, not all of them have gotten to Final Fours. Mm-hmm. So May's got that over him, but he also in some ways you could analyze the track record and say, well, it's not as impressive. He didn't do it as long as some of these other guys have. So you can play that any way you want. But one thing is unquestionable. They're going to be better at the top. There's no doubt about it. And if you have any real need to see how important a head coach is in college basketball, look to Michigan the last couple of years. Yeah. Because nobody would argue with the idea that he had some good assistants. I mean, Sadie Washington, Tom Izzo took him on. And I think if Michigan State had not been involved, some other high major would have taken him. That's a guy with a long track record of success. Yeah. Phil Martelli, Jesus, as a head coach, tremendous track record at St. Joe's. So, and it didn't matter. None of that mattered because the head coach was in the head coaching position was in disarray. So they're going to be better just based on that alone. You can just start there. Now, I do think you look at a roster that's been overturned this heavily. Most of these guys have never played together. There's a handful of exceptions, but not many. And I do think it was interesting, and I haven't seen too many people zero in on this. It makes me curious. I think the initial thought was more guys would follow him from FAU. That didn't happen. Whatever the reasoning is, it might not be anything nefarious. It might have been that, for example, I think it was John L. Davis, the guard who was considered the best player at FAU, ended up at Arkansas. And that, that's probably an NIL, and we know, as I was saying earlier, Michigan has had problems in NIL in basketball. So they might just not have been able to compete financially there. But one thing that sometimes happens with new coaches in this portal period is they're actually able to bring some continuity in with them if they can bring along a few guys from their previous stop who had played together.
Right.
That has not really happened here because he's only got one guy who played for him at FAU. So he doesn't get any benefit in terms of continuity in that regard. He's got 3 guys back in Michigan's program, so that's okay, but you don't have – they're playing in a different system with different teammates, all of that. Basically, you're starting from scratch, and so that's a disadvantage that he's working with. But look, my track record, my bona fides on this, I think, are well earned. I'm not ever likely to give these guys more credit than they're due, ever. But I have to say objectively, it looks to me as if he did a reasonably good job considering the circumstances in the portal. You start with a center who is potentially an all-conference type player at some level. I think that's a fair assessment of what Golden can be. You add Donaldson, looks like he's got everything you'd need to be at least a solid Big Ten point guard and maybe the potential to be better than that. You add Gale, who had some issues last year, but hey, he's a proven Big Ten starter. Jones, ton of production at a lower level school. in a variety of ways. So there's at least reason to hope that he can be effective at this level, at least a very good rotation guy. And Burnett, who you would think maybe could be a little bit better, at least being asked to do a little bit less. You know, if he's a starter, he's probably the fifth option offensively in that group. You start with that, then you've added Wolf and Walters, two highly skilled foremen. You've got defensive questions there, but offensively, that seems to be both very good additions. Shetter, as we said, he's got issues, but he's also got one very big strength. So you've at least got a bunch of big men who can really shoot the ball. That's a nice element to have in combination with Golden, who looks like he'll be a very effective player in the post. So you've got reason for optimism. I think the downsides, the things that put a check on that optimism, would be the 4 spot being a nightmare defensively, potentially, because I just don't see a good answer there on that end. They're all bad. And that you don't have any continuity. The last one is an obvious thing to say, but as we've talked about, in the modern era, this is just the way it is. And so some teams are going to figure it out and some teams won't. So as much as with anybody else we're talking about, this is a guess. So where I get to is I look at the track record of the guys they've added, what they've got coming back, and then to some extent you've got to factor in what that coach has done. And I'm giving Michigan a little bit of a benefit of the doubt because of May's Final Four 2 years ago. That would be an indication that when you give this guy material to work with, he can produce results. So that's why I've got them where they are. Could they finish 13th? Absolutely. Could they finish 4th? Maybe. I mean, that's probably about the ceiling. I have a hard time seeing them winning the league. But could they be better than I've got them? Yeah, I think that's possible if enough things break the right way. But it'll at least, for one of the few Michigan fans that actually exist, it will at least be more entertaining for you and your 13 friends to follow this team. Because they will actually play competent basketball. Dusty May, I think, is a guy you trust. We haven't really talked very much about style of play other than to say I think they want to play fast. I think they will be more exciting in that way. I think defensively, he hasn't exhibited any evidence really that he's a great defensive coach. But man, when you play defense the way Michigan has the last couple of years, particularly last year, down looks like up to you.
Yeah.
Right?
They're almost as bad as Iowa. They were really bad.
Yeah. And I don't think they'll be that bad this year, even if there are some holes. I think I have more faith in this. And he's got an interesting staff. He's got another former head coach, Mike Boynton, who had been the head coach at Oklahoma State. He added him to his staff. So he's got an interesting mix of guys with some real experience on that staff. So he didn't just bring all his guys from FAU over. So, the pick is partially based on the job I think he did in the portal, which is tough to judge. But I guess where I get to as well is, as opposed to some of the other teams we've talked about previously, I can look at Michigan's roster and I can see the fit.
Yeah.
I say, okay, they got a real point guard. They might have two. Check. They've got some legitimate wings. Check. They've got big men. Check. I mean, they at least make sense. Where some of these teams, they've got holes. Like we've talked about, like USC, not much size. Ton of wings, not much size. There are these issues with some teams that I don't think are as likely to rear their heads at Michigan. So that's also a reason they get a little bit of benefit for the doubt from me.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there, and we'll see him on the court, I guess, in not too much longer at this point, a little less than a month away. Just a reminder, if you want to go support the show, we really appreciate that. You head over to the Final Four SNotTheSchedule.com/support. You can also find ways to link to all our sponsors, Nudge Printing, Brothers Suggest Two Gutters, and the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. So until next time, and the number 6 team, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.